Good Tuesday night. I am Thabo Mdluli, and thank you for joining us tonight on Newzroom Afrika channel 405. This is your newsfeed late night. Today I'm joined by One SA movement leader Mmusi Maimane to discuss everything from the state of the nation to what he has to offer as an independent candidate in the elections, and everything else you wish to address. You can also raise those issues with us tonight. Be part of the conversation. Tag us, as I mentioned, on Twitter at Newzroom 405. Send us your WhatsApp questions and comments to 072-110-5584. Mmusi Maimane, good evening, and thank you very much for joining us tonight on the Newsfeed Late Night. I don't know, I mean, you've been having so much fun since you've been out of politics. On Sundays, you are the preacher that you are. But yet again, I don't know whether to introduce you with a little bit of speakeasy featuring Professor. I mean, you've been having a whole lot of fun. How do you feel that, I mean, 2 years on, you've been once again brought into this equation of the fate of the Democratic Alliance in 2019? You've been fairly quiet about it.
Good evening, and good evening to fellow South Africans. I think, Thabo, you know, when you lack a vision for tomorrow, you tend to look backwards. And I think that's what's going on at the moment, in that the DA hasn't been able to craft that alternative vision, that view that they can build a party for all South Africans, which is what we were working towards looking forward. And ultimately now, if you can't commit to tomorrow, you have to look at yesterday and blame what happened, which in many ways is false, and ultimately means that as South Africans, we have the tough duty of building that alternative. You can't have your opposition party standing up in South Africa rather than, in fact, giving an alternative, picking a faction of the governing party, and ultimately even suggesting that the past is where we should look to. That's why at One SA, I'm working my life to build that grassroots movement of all South Africans to charter a new future for our nation.
How is Project Grassroots coming along?
Yeah, it's quite exciting. You know, we've been able to attract many activists across the country. We're now established in all 9 provinces. And I think for me, the thing that's most exciting is that as we're going into communities, people are resonating with the ideals we stand for. I think for the majority of people in this country, they're saying, we want a South Africa for all, a racially harmonized country. I think many people are offended by racism. They cannot tolerate it, whether it's unconscious or conscious. They simply do not accept it. I think that more than anything, most people are actually wanting a better education for their kids. They recognize that the education the South African government is giving us is producing kids who cannot compete at a global level, and certainly are finding joining the ranks of the unemployed. I think many people are just wanting to know where they're going to find their next meal, get a next job, and ensure that our communities are safe. And lastly, I think most people, as I'm speaking more and more to them, they're sick and tired of politics and politicians. They look at the political parties, and the ring I hear the most, you know, whether it's Ukokwe, Etopsi, or wherever, they say to me, it seems like all the interest is in fighting rather than, in fact, the idea of serving people. I think that, to me, is an indicator that if we're going to bring change in this country, it needs to be from the bottom up rather than from the top down.
Yeah. Is it the same as, I mean, I'm talking here about Project Grassroots, as the narrative of a realignment of politics that John Steenhuisen is talking about, also linking you to it, because he accuses you of having a slight case of amnesia, because he says this is what you've always been talking about?
Well, I think one of the visions I put forward was the fact that when I was working in the DA, I argued strongly that the first objective is to remove the ANC. And I've been unequivocal about that. I said it at the election of President Ramaphosa. I said, we must understand that the problem with the ANC, and it's not a hatred of the ANC, it's about what truly the 94 project was about. It wasn't about building a one-party state that would dominate South Africa. It was about building a democratic government upon which competitive elections can come past, so that parties can lose power peacefully and it can transition from one party to the next. I made that case quite clear. The second case I made is to say we have to work with people who share common values, and those people are across many different parties and organizations. And if you're going to achieve that, that's why when I say I'm going back to grassroots, I'm saying that leadership is not just a function of political parties. You've got incredible leaders in business. You've got incredible leaders in civil society, in faith-based communities. We must give them the opportunity to be able to come forward, bound around a set of values or pacts, and we can be able to achieve that. And I even went further to say there may very well be some people who may have an affiliation with the ANC or think that the ANC is the future, but who have given up because the ANC has given up on their dream, who may want to be part of a new dream, a future for South Africa. And that's what I've always articulated, and I still maintain that going forward, you cannot work with the ANC as it stands. It simply has got bad policies. It's got, at this point in time, a serious case of corruption and a case to answer before the people of South Africa. You cannot work with them. And I think we need to see a second transition. And that second transition would be indeed when we usher in a new government that's not ANC-led.
Is it also your idea that that government would be ushered in by, I suppose, black progressives who will gather enough momentum and enough numbers to form a new majority center? Is that even possible?
It is absolutely possible. If it is something that we've got to get right, it's got to be all citizens. And I think it's those progressive South Africans, black and white, across all racial places, across all communities, who are willing to stand up for these values that I articulate, the value of an inclusive economy. Because as we stand at the moment, whether we can accept it or not, it's unsustainable to have over 11 million people unemployed. It is unsustainable to have an economy that works for a few when many are left out. It is unsustainable to ultimately ensure we live with such high levels of crime and an environment that is damaged and an education system that doesn't work. So when we can agree on this, and I know as much as I know that South Africa, its future lies in the hands of all of those South Africans coming together, agreeing that we've got to recognize that the best way to fix our past is to charter a new future for our kids. And that must address those areas I've highlighted. Jobs for South Africans, an economy that is inclusive, an education for the future, and public representatives that are accountable to them. So to me, I think it's well within us. Because if we don't get that project right, then ultimately we will be hostage to what happens at Luthuli House or at the NEC. And I don't think that's democracy. I think that is a one-party state, which I think that it will hamper our democracy. And secondly, if we create that situation, we'll always be polarized on racial lines, because you are going to end up in a scenario where you have so-called black parties and so-called white parties, which is not the future of our country. The future of our country lies with those South Africans who share those values, willing to work together to charter a different alternative.
Now, there are those progressive, one might say, Mmusi, that are straddling the line, who believe in inclusive growth, very strongly so, who believe in things like redress, who believes in things like white privilege. And they are progressive, they're straddling that line, and they are wanting to hear you, for example, distancing yourself from a language that speaks about, scaremongering around issues of expropriation, for example, issues of broad-based economic empowerment. They want to hear you at least being very clear around where you sit on that.
I've never wavered on this issue. And I think the recognition of racial inequality in this country, or inequality born out of racial injustice in our history, is something I've never been apologetic about. The income of white South Africans is 6-to-1 of that of black South Africans. So if you want to debate the question of white privilege, maybe I might give you a better term and say, let's talk about advancement or white advantage that has been derived as a function of the past. My wife is a white South African. She shares the same view. So it's not a question of even just black people identifying that issue. It's white South Africans standing up and saying, we recognize the fact that we benefited from a history, and we recognize the fact that if we're going to fix the future, we know we'd have to do everything possible to not only benefit from that, but to be able to address an inclusive economy. Those are the South Africans I want to work with. And secondly, when it comes to the question of redress, again, it ought not to be a value that is only shared only by black South Africans. It must be shared by progressive South Africans of all races, because it is ultimately in the interests of black and white people to say it is an injustice to live in a country where the face of poverty is largely black, largely female, and in the main, often rural. So therefore, we have to work harder at saying what economic policies do we put on the table that not only diversify our economy. I'll take a sector like insurance. It cannot be that we've got so few insurance houses. We have to do better at starting up new ones, adding Black South Africans into those businesses so that there's equity being transferred and so that actually economies work in communities that never worked before. So I think that is a value that is shared by citizens across all races, because if you don't achieve that, you end up in a scenario where the contestation is still yet again black versus white, whereas in economic terms, it is in fact a function of what future do we want to see and how can we all work together, because we realize there can never be peace until there is justice, inclusion, redress, and a future focus.
Well, we have a real challenge in this country, one of social cohesion in our nation. It's a very serious and a real problematic one. I want to tackle that with you when we come back from the break. With me, the One SA movement leader, Mmusi Maimane. You can be a part of this conversation. Tag us now at Newzroom 405. WhatsApp your questions and your comments to 072-110-5584. We'll take those in a moment. The Newsfeed Late Night continues next. And welcome back here with the Newsfeed Late Night on Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. Thanks for staying with us. With us tonight, One SA movement leader, Mmusi Maimane. To be a part of the conversation, do tag us on Twitter at Newzroom 405. WhatsApp your questions and comments to 072-110-5584. Now, before the break, Mmusi, I mentioned that, of course, social cohesion, a big issue in South Africa. In fact, a big challenge that permeates all sectors of society. Where were you today when the ANC was marching against racism?
You know, I laugh not because I think racism is funny, but I find it ironic that you have a government that would march against itself. What kind of government do you have that simply cannot understand the fact that it built institutions that attend to the question of racism? You know, we have the Equality Court. We have, in fact, laws that allow us the space to prosecute racism and deal with it. In this particular instance, if you understand the genesis of the issue, there is a bias, whether conscious or unconscious, that was demonstrated. I think that it's about time that we begin to attend to it. I've happened to have interactions with the journalist in mind, and I think more than anything, what we've got to do is ensure that there's appropriate counseling on the issue, condemn the act of racism, because sometimes when we shift it in the space of conscious or unconscious, we sometimes mask other issues that occur in terms of opportunity. Ultimately, I think that what the NCA statement came out on that board, I didn't think was sufficient. I think it was a bad argument to start off with. And then furthermore, let's ensure that there's a form of compensation that she can demonstrate. And in that instance, we show citizens that the destination isn't to start jails for people who we deem racist, but the destination is that we must not lose the value, which is the next phase of where we've got to go, is ensuring that when we talk about a reconciled South Africa, what do we mean? Because to be fair, Thabo, I think it would be naive of us to not recognize that all of us have got a set of bias, our own selves. We have a bias about what power looks like. We have a bias around race relations. We have biases. And we have to continuously confront those so that ultimately we can work this project of a reconciled society. I think it would be amiss of me to not recognize that fact, because in truth, it is a societal wound that we've got to begin to heal. The second challenge on this issue is that this is where my frustration with the ANC is. The ANC is not led on this issue of reconciliation. It has not led on this issue. It is doing it for political populism, mainly because it has created prevailing conditions of South Africa where party politics are racial in mind. So in essence, in this country, you have, as I said, black parties, white parties. And when that happens and you fail the project of a reconciled South Africa, of course, then people will only deem the very race conversations in that way, and then end up with arguments about saying, well, this party is against this race. Where are the other incidents where there are other structural racism that is occurring that the government is not attending to?
Yeah.
Where are the circumstances upon which we can all stand up together and say, whether black or white, if you are racist, South Africans in general must deal with it. So I think, to me, it is a misnomer. I think the ANC is at a loss, and I think they're a populist they're turning more and more populist at the expense of providing genuine leadership to the people of this
but what are the prevailing conditions at the moment that allow for populists to thrive and populist narratives to thrive?
Well, I think, we don't have to look far, but when we begin to understand the economy as it stands at the moment, it allows for populists to thrive. When you've got so many people unemployed, if of the young people who are unemployed, in provinces like Limpopo and Mpumalanga, the chances of them remaining unemployed are at 60%. I think that is a concerning scenario, because it means when people have got nothing left to lose, they are left up to hands and ideals that are not suitable to the democratic project. And so populists will arise. They will offer people cheap solutions to very complicated problems. And ultimately, I think it's because it feels in this country like the adults have left the room. I often say this, that when an incident, whether it be Clicks, whether it be Brackenfell, whether it be on the economy, whether it be on whatever incident that takes place, when your government, led by the president or the deputy president, cannot give a pronouncement on that issue, cannot be able to invite people to appropriate dialogues and use the institutions that exist, whether it's the Equality Court or whether it's the processes that exist, then of course it becomes free for all. Not to sound biblical, but in a nation where a nation is without vision, people perish. And that's what we are seeing currently. That's why populists are rising. And they find blame in circumstances that often don't exist. It's quick and easy and tempting to simply say, well, we'll blame the foreigners, we'll blame this race, we'll blame that gender, in failing to give leadership and being able to say, here's our economic plan, here's how we deal with structural racism, here's how we deal with incidents of racism, so that all citizens can be able to understand all of those processes, knowing that the destination is always to build a South Africa that works for all people. But if you're not going to give that vision, ultimately you're going to end up with a free-for-all and populists giving cheap solutions.
You have populists on the one hand, and you have what is called radical socialists, and tends to be a language of crowing the radical socialists. They say, well, they are the problems that are causing all this that we are seeing in the country. For example, you've got some RET forces, which, depends, you call it radical economic transformation or you call it inclusive growth. And they're saying those are the people who are the problem for this nation. What's your view?
I think our political discourse is poor. To be honest with you, we tend to fixate on labels at the expense of genuinely hearing one another and crafting solutions. So part of what underpins this problem is that when you're stuck on labels, you then really migrate quickly to this cancel culture that's also emerged, that we fail to hear an argument. If someone stands up and says, well, there's inequality, or there's white privilege, or there's black poverty, etc., if we don't agree with that view, we tend to cancel that view and cancel the person without wanting to hear more about what needs to happen. So in this particular instance, there is no debate. South Africa needs a radical change and a radical solution. At first, it must be political. Secondly, it must be economical. You cannot sustain a view upon which you don't introduce a basic income grant, however expensive that is. Citizens cannot be at the coalface of poverty while so many other people are living well. It prevails, it perpetuates the level of inequality that we've got. You cannot keep an economy that is hobbling along at this level. So whether it's however radical it must be, the radical aspect of it is that you need strong energy that is sustainable, that will make sure we keep the lights on. We have to ensure that without doubt, when we talk about economic growth, where is the investment in new firms, new capital, new companies? When you reflect on the 1994 democratic project, you have to say, where are the big companies that have begun that ultimately ensure that there's mass employment that comes? How are we radicalizing the fact that we build micro-enterprise at a strong level? So I'd introduce a venture capital fund. Where is the sense upon which we truly stop seeing our communities still expressed in certain provinces on racial lines, that we take a radical stance that says, actually, it's unsustainable that you can have a community that just simply is one race and another one that's another race? How do you help be able to say, when it comes to the question of wealth and inclusion, You're going to take strong policies and be able to implement them. Where do we take a strong stance on the capability of the state? That when people are not delivering according to their mandate, those people are moved out of the state, arrested if they are corrupt, but ultimately building that capable, future-focused state. We talk a lot about many things in this country and we never deliver. So, and I think it's because the state is incapable. When we talk about being future-focused, how is it, Thabo, today that young people still have to pay such exorbitant prices on data, and we mollycoddle this issue as if it's going to continue? It is about time we allocate spectrum so that we can drive down the cost of data so that all citizens are digitally included at a very cheap price.
I'm going to come to your Gallic-free economic ideas in just a moment. I want to talk about exactly what you're raising when as you talk about the capable state, right? What do you make of now that you are out of politics? Okay, you want to come in, but you're no longer in the Democratic Alliance, where previously you've been lamenting government and their social spending. Now the Department of Finance, Treasury, has cut the spend on social grants.
No, I think that I must give context to this issue. I've never been an opponent of welfare. I've certainly been said it's part of our redress mechanism. Instead, what I'm now trying to say, which is even stronger, is that when it comes to public good and ensuring that there's a much greater inclusion, we must be radical on that idea. Grants are but one welfare dynamic. Basic income is quite a different. It makes sure that people don't fall below. There's a poverty floor that people are flowing through. And ultimately, even at the DA, part of the big debate that I constantly used to have is that I used to ask the question, and you can ask any DA public representative, I said, on whose behalf are we fighting for? And if we are not fighting on behalf of the poor in this country, because we have a poverty problem, 54% of our citizens are living below the upper poverty line. If we are not fighting on their behalf, we are going to face an unstable and unsustainable future for South Africa. So I've never wavered on this issue. I've argued modalities as to how we can do it better rather than not doing it, rather than being inefficient. And to be honest, more than anything, I've always maintained that I would start a Jobs and Justice Fund. You can go through any speech I've delivered on it here. And Jobs and Justice Fund to do two things: stimulate job creation by introducing venture capital to new startups and ensuring that there's economic growth.
But didn't you say in the heat of campaigning that the only reason why the ANC maintains social grants is so that they can use them for votes?
No, I've never said that, because I've always maintained that they were part. Why I think the ANC keeps a particular model, and that's why even to the argument about the weekend papers, when the ANC lost Johannesburg and we formed coalitions, sometimes coalitions are hard, but it is important for people to know that when the ANC is out, grants do not disappear. That was the argument I made and still made, because the ANC went out to tell people to say, if you remove us out of power, then grants are also gone. So I wanted to disprove that theory by saying that we will remove you out of an NMB, Joburg, all the other places, yet people will still continue to get grant, and ultimately we can have an economic condition upon which people don't have to depend on grants only, but they can get work. That is the argument I constantly make.
Okay, we'll continue in a moment, and you are letting us in on what is happening at Eskom at the moment, and you seem to believe that there is a continuation of the capture of the power utility, or at least an attempt to do so. We'll get more details from you in just a moment. The One SA movement leader, Mmusi Maimane, you can be a part of the conversation. Tag us now on Twitter. I see a lot of you saying on Twitter tonight you would like to hear more his vision for the future. The DA is in the past now. When I hear what he has to offer as he goes forward, we'll hear from him when we come back. Do stay with us. All right, welcome back. You're with us here on the Newsfeed Late Night, and our continued look at, of course, matters that have got to do with the nation. Tonight, a guest looking at all issues in South Africa at the moment is the leader of the One SA movement, Mmusi Maimane. Of course, we're taking your thoughts as well tonight on Twitter at Newzroom 405, or WhatsApp your questions and comments to 072-110-5584. We'll get to those in just a moment. But Mmusi, let's talk a little bit then about what you're saying is happening at the power utility. You're saying there's more Gupta looting on the horizon, or at least the capture of the energy sector continues. What information do you have?
Yeah, you see, on behalf of citizens of South Africa who have been asked to pay an additional 15% increase on Eskom prices, we have to understand that the generation of energy is delivered through the coal supply deal that was entered in with Optimum Mine, which was a Gupta-owned mine. Now, when that asset has now been put on business rescue, it's become quite clear that in voting for the business rescue plan, a company called Central, which already has been shown to have other Gupta links through other companies, and the Bermuda court has found against them in this regard. That company is now looking to get a settlement out of that Optimum business rescue process, where ultimately those funds will be funneled back to the Guptas. So to me, I think you cannot double dip. You cannot loot up front, and then when it comes to the credit rescue mechanism, loot again. Secondly, on that part, we maintain that the coal agreements that had taken place between Optimum and Eskom need to be evaluated during that period, because there was inflated pricing on that issue, and therefore we must recoup that cost, because that cost is what makes Eskom's balance sheet sit as where it is now. Yeah. So the steps I've really wanted to put in place is to say, I want to understand from the Eskom board what the rationality behind the decision to support the business rescue plan. Secondly, can we institute an investigation into how this process is entered into with Central, and then how can we recoup the financing to ensure that Eskom's balance sheet doesn't have to depend on a multi-year 15% increase to which consumers must pay. Yeah. So when we are asking the people of South Africa to pay for corruption tax in this instance, can we ultimately do the thorough investigation so that the voice of the consumer is on the table? So that's the fight, and I'm wanting to halt the process so that we get to the bottom of where this particular company and its links are coming from.
So when you are asking for those or records of those contracts, are you just only interested in the Optimum contracts? Here's why I'm asking.
Correct.
Because there are issues being raised even now at the Commission that there are evergreen contracts at Eskom that are untouchable, and that is part of the capture of the power utility. Are you at all interested, do you have an appetite to go into those contracts and have a look at what's going on there?
Yeah. I mean, I think to me, my primary interest is we cannot be paying for incompetence and corruption. So if there are contracts that even sit at Eskom right now today that are not favorable to the consumer, then ultimately we must fight against those. But I think in us being able to preserve what is Eskom and failing to diversify investment in energy so that new competitors can come on board, so that we can ensure that we can, at least where metros who are competent to be able to provide energy and build new power plants must be able to do so, we are going to be hobbled by this entity to the detriment of the economy and the people of this country. We have to think differently, and we have to eliminate capture so that we can diversify energy for the future. So I would be interested in that, and I've been following quite carefully what has been happening at the Zondo Commission in this regard. But I also think that we need to have a better vision for the future of energy in this country.
So, I mean, essentially what you're calling for is for the business rescue process to be halted completely, or in fact just cancelled altogether, or at least that company not benefit anything from it. That 100 million must never be paid out to them.
Ultimately, because we need to understand that that money does not end up, with the current evidence that we've got, does not end up in Gupta-linked entities going forward, and that actually that business rescue process be reviewed, halted, and that actually a thorough process ensures that when we're paying back creditors, we're paying back the right creditors, not the creditors who looted from us.
And where are you in that process of getting those documents?
I have made already contact with Eskom, and certainly I'm committed to the future. I'm committed to, so I've made contact with the Eskom board, and will be writing to the Minister of Public Enterprises to hold this process. And then once we get the record of decision, we'll be able to then take the appropriate steps going forward, because we've also got to follow due process in this regard. So we're filing those applications as we go.
Now look at our institutions of state, at least in the last 3 years with the so-called New Dawn that came into being. How have they performed, right? Including the judiciary, including the security cluster. Have they been acting in the manner that they should?
You know, Thabo, it's a very important question that you ask, because you can't deny the fact that since the introduction, in fact, as earlier on as President Mandela's tenure, when the National Democratic Revolution went out of its way to say we will capture the levers of state, it placed vulnerability in certain areas. You cannot be appointing a public protector of all of them at Luthuli House vis-a-vis actually, and making sure that when the candidate arrives in parliament, a majoritarian vote simply carries that candidate. You put yourself at risk because, yes, on one day you can end up with Thuli Madonse, and on another day you can end up with Mmusi. And it's the same with the National Director of Public Prosecutions. It's the same as, so this policy of cadre deployment has become a problem, but B, it's exacerbated by a political system of majoritarianism. So you don't have direct elections of politicians. They are not held accountable to any constituency. So what happens is they get told what the party line is. If the chief whip says you'll vote for this person, it doesn't matter whether the person is competent or incompetent, you just end up in that way. And then ultimately, even an institution like the Judicial Services Commission, when you look at how the numbers in terms of voting are put on the table, we need to be able to review that to make sure that there's actual proper parliamentary oversight and scrutiny on that, on all of these issues. And so for me, I think it's been a mixed bag. I think the judiciary has done an exceptional job. I think that in the leadership of the chief justices we've had before and the current one, we've seen really, really good work happen there. But it doesn't mean the system is not vulnerable, because when you then ascertain how even magistrates and all that whole process in terms of judges at lower courts are appointed, there's a vulnerability there. Secondly, I think that when we look at the question of the National Director of Public Prosecutions, if Mmusi Maimane was present today, I can assure you, it should be something that we must review in our constitution to say that the appointment of the National Director of Public Prosecution must be something that must restore back to Parliament. Because when you do it that way, you can ensure that the president, any president, cannot simply arrive and say, well, this will be my NDPP, because then you safeguard yourself against the abuses of power. And then furthermore, when I look at other state institutions, I think institutional capacity is made vulnerable in this country by a feature of cadre deployment, but also politicians that are not accountable to anyone. They end up doing what they feel like doing. So we need a review of the electoral process so that politicians are accountable and they vote the wishes of the people rather than just the party. And I think we need to think harder about what powers we've given the presidency so that we restore a sense upon which Parliament and the work that it does there is able to give accountability and voice of the people.
Now, when we're talking, one of the suggestions that you're making around education, right, we're going to look back at this relationship that you're having with this department. I mean, one would say you're having a love-hate relationship maybe with the MEC of Education in Gauteng, judging by the jabs that you throw at each other on Twitter, but you're a little bit more stronger on the Minister of Education, and you want her completely out. You're saying the education system is plagued by bad management and poor standards. So, and your big idea is that pay teachers more, resource the schools, raise the pass mark back to 50%, and
Correct.
That's the silver bullet. Everything will be fixed.
Not only that, if you get the best leadership in this country, we don't ask the best of our kids. We ask our kids to just do the bare minimum. I think that furthermore, and I also added into, because I tabled 5 ideas, one of the key things is about making sure we introduce blended learning so that ultimately kids are digital citizens as much as they have contact in the classroom, so that you've got a combination of both so our kids can compete. But if you don't have quality teachers and quality teaching happening in the classroom, you are hamstringing the kids. If you don't have quality leadership in principals who are able to say, we've got vision for education that can work, you are going to hamstring that school. And ultimately, if you don't fix the infrastructure of the schools, you end up in such circumstances as I have, where my own sister's children are going to a school where there are 60 children in class. They end up in some ways where the teacher is not capable of being able to deal with all those classes. And you have a differentiator of an unequal education system. I will say this again and again. If we do not focus on the STEM subject, maths and science, give the best opportunities, when you reflect on just that, the pass rate there has been declining in the last number of years. The participation of children in that space is getting lesser and lesser. So when we wonder how our economy is going to be hamstrung in the future. Our kids are not going to be digital citizens and compete in the future. So I think we have a minister who has no vision for education. That's why when she delivers a speech at a school, she doesn't talk about how bright kids can be or how can they work. Instead, she tells them nonsense like people who are educated do not rape and all sorts of things like that, which is crazy at its best. But the statement, not only is it false and insulting to victims of gender-based violence, it is mad because here in a school, she should be inspiring leadership and inspiring the value of education, and she can't even do that basic task. And when it comes to MEC of Education in Gauteng, Mr. Lesufi, I think our love comes from the fact that he's involved with Moroka Swallows, who are based in Dobsonville, which is where I'm from. And I think our hate part of our relationship is that he is part of a system of education that is, in my view, lowering the quality of education in our country.
What do you mean?
I mean exactly that. That in fact that system.
I mean, he will tell you, for example, of what he has achieved in Gauteng with the pass rate sitting where it is above the 80s. But he'll also tell you of e-learning, moving the schooling system to e-learning and the number of e-schools that he's building. Saying, well, I do have a vision of a blended learning environment. I do have a vision of moving our kids starting very earlier on into that sphere of understanding our education system.
On that score, we agree, but he must tell me equally so in which schools has he been able to reward the best teachers in a differentiated manner. So when I talk about being part of a system, what incentive is there for a teacher to improve their marks? There simply is none, because even if you do well, your rewards are exactly the same as if you do badly. So where are we creating incentive for the best public servants to be rewarded better? Secondly, we know we have a history of where teachers, sometimes some of them, end up in our public schools who over time have not been able to participate in this blended learning. Why are they still there? How do we retire them with these and introduce new fresh blood to be able to take it going forward? So whilst Mr. Lesufi is arguing that case, and I challenged him last year during COVID, I said, come with me to schools so we ensure that they are COVID ready. And I went to some schools in Gauteng that still to this day are still, in some of them, don't have running water, and in certain instances, infrastructure is poor. So I want us to get onto the ground and make sure that we transform education. When you look at nations who are prospering today, and a very good example of this is when you look at Southeast Asia, the value of education is enhanced, the leadership is in place, maths and science are at the forefront, tech is a given, not something that is privileged for a few, and data is available, and ultimately you ensure that the best are rewarded to do their job. And lastly, as I suggested, we need an education inspectorate, as we've learned in countries like the US. We need fresh ideas for the future of education in this country. If we have none, I'm telling you now, you're going to end up with people with money getting a better education and people without money actually getting a poor education, which means that we perpetuate this divide that is already in existence.
When I say movement leader, Mmusi Maimane with us. When we continue next, we talk how to fix the economy, right? You can be a part of the conversation. Tag us on Twitter. I see Duma's tweet. We're going to come to it in a moment at Newzroom 405, and we'll take your WhatsApp questions and comments. 072-110-5584. The Newsfeed Late Night continues next. Right, we're back with you now here on the Newsfeed Late Night and our conversation with One SA movement leader, Mmusi Maimane. You can be a part of this conversation by tagging us on Newzroom 405. WhatsApp us your questions and comments on 072-110-5584. Let's take to Twitter and see what Dumi says. Dumi wants to take you a little bit back. Mmusi Maimane says, why do leaders who leave the Democratic Alliance never tell us the real reasons why they left, and they seem to hide something or some info about racism in the DA?
Vision. I've said it to you before that my challenge with what is going on, I had a vision for a South Africa for all. That's what I wanted to work for. It would seem, and this is my impression of what's going on at the moment, there were those who opposed that. And now they are stating in a position where they ultimately want to regress the party to focus on only some people. So to me, incidents and all of that become narrow in the contrast of this big vision. Because this is my fear. My fear is simply this. You can't have the Freedom Front Plus being a party for Afrikaans South Africans. Then you have the DA being a party for minority South Africans. And then you have the ANC and the FF being a party for black South Africans. Then if you want the election results, we better look at the census score and say, here are the census results, let's conclude. We have to get back to building that movement in between. And that's been my focus. As for the other issues, without trying to get the spice into this meat that we're chewing, I would urge that I'll be writing a particular book on this particular issue, and I'll certainly expound a little bit more on the challenges that we face, because I think sometimes the vision and the objectives, when people cannot see them, they can reduce them to some of these incidents that occur that point to a bigger truth, which is, does in fact an ambition exist within any political party to build a movement of all South Africans? And I would argue it doesn't exist at this point in time.
I chuckle because it seems most politicians who are avoiding to answer questions these days are telling us they'll write a book about it and they'll reveal it in due course.
No, I'm not avoiding it. That's what I'm saying. I have no.
I mean, you were very clear on your tweet. In fact, you said John and Helen do not care about fixing the problems of this nation. Is that at the core of why you left? And when did you realize it? Before or after you left?
Because let me give you one simple incident. When I was towards the latter part, I remember there was an investigation that went into why the DA lost votes in a community called Swizer-Reneka in the Northwest. That became a long discussion inside the DA, and it was really between the current leadership. They went and fought that issue, ran investigations. There was a whole ton of things in that regard. But the question that nobody seemed to want to answer me was to say, why is it that where we've been in government in perhaps maybe the Western Cape, why were citizens in Khayelitsha not falling over backwards to vote for the DA? That is a question. And that is a question we must interrogate. So these are the issues on the table. You can obsess on Swizer-Reneka on one end, but fail to obsess on the fact that why is it that even when you govern, where you govern, citizens who live in Khayelitsha are not interested in it? That is a question. So to me, it's... So when I say they are not interested in fixing those problems, the lazy part to do in any society is to say, well, we're colorblind, which seems to nullify the history of the country, ignores the fact that we have a past of injustice. Then you don't have a reason to fix anything. But if you recognize that injustice and you say to yourself, we're going to give ourselves to fixing that problem by offering solutions of the future, digital social solutions, because that's an opportunity that we've got that is able to fast-track economic growth, include more people, and actually achieve redress, you then must be aggressive and focus on that. And I'm not hearing that from the DNC. I'm hearing quite the opposite, this idea that we are colorblind and therefore perhaps maybe, I'm not sure, if you are colorblind, how then do you have a diverse caucus? How then do you ensure that you deal with historical injustices? What historical injustices in a colorblind universe?
All right, let's talk about how do we fix our economy. I mean, real concrete interventions, it seems. I mean, what our government is saying, they're going to push for austerity, showing that the goal is still to demonstrate fiscal discipline. So we're not going to spend more than we are getting. They are pinning their hopes on industrial zones or manufacturing zones or master plans. I think that's what they are calling them for the various sectors, poultry, automobile, etc., etc. They're also talking about infrastructure. So there are some infrastructure projects on the horizon that will be the potential for growth. I mean, I'm just summarizing. Of course, there's a whole lot more that they're talking about. What do you think of what they are saying so far? Does it make sense to you? And what are the immediate things that they can immediately achieve?
Some of those fundamentals are absolutely correct. So whether you build infrastructure, that you should do. The fact of the matter is that we have an incapable state. So it doesn't matter what they say. In some ways, I get frustrated listening to government because, frankly, because they are so incapable, I don't believe anything they say, and I don't believe they are capable of being able to do what they say. Because the evidence is before us. Infrastructure is crumbling. The Val Dam is contaminated. Communities are without water, and we have no electricity. So it's nonsense what they're talking about. What I think we must do is review two things. Firstly, how do we attract foreign investment and domestic investment in a far easier way and in targeted sectors? how do we think as Africa and be able to say we've got a much bigger market in Africa. We've got 1.2 billion citizens that are coming here. Many of them are young. They will need tech. They will need infrastructure. They will need growth. So how do we think about an energy grid for SADC, as an example, not just for South Africa, for SADC? Because when you do that, you can have a mix of energy, whether it's gas and coal, whether you can end up with a combination of solar and different technologies that can deal with the grid for SADC in its entirety. How do we set up a jobs and justice fund that is able to be used as venture capital fund so we stimulate micro-enterprise, particularly enterprises that come from black communities? This way we can ensure that new entities are coming on the market. The fact of the matter is that when we think about inventions and where people have come up with new ideas in South Africa, even in the mineral sector, we've been very poor at discovering those. So to modernize the economy requires you to invest financially into that. And that's why I'm calling for this Jobs and Justice Fund to be created. When we talk about capable and efficient state, how do we ensure that in tendering and delivery of tenders, that actually payments are done in a much more effective way, particularly in localized communities, so people who are doing business in Johannesburg and are paid by the municipality of Joburg are paid well. So to me, the broader vision is let's deconcentrate our economy. Let's actually make sure cities are at the forefront of growth. Let's introduce a Jobs and Justice Fund. Let's pump up skills so that we fix our education system, because whether I like it or not, the competence of labor will be able to deliver new industries of the future, and then target a few industries where we can make it efficient. Where that's in tourism, let's make sure that, and I support the president in this regard, this visa issue, we must make it easy, make it digital so people can arrive in this country. How do we intertrade in Africa so that moving of goods in Africa is quicker and easier, and giving electronic visas within that place? So the Africa Free Trade Agreement is a very important one. And then ultimately, how do we eradicate corruption out of the system? Because you can't deny that it hampers economic growth when people feel like they need insider trading if they are going to achieve their prosperity. So
on that score, how are we doing? Are we making headway in dealing with corruption? Or are you suggesting having a corruption court, in fact, that just deals with corruption, pretty something similar to, I suppose, having a land court at the moment, which is what we're talking about. But also, you are pushing for more prosecution, in fact, more private prosecution.
I still maintain a corruption court is a necessary issue because, you know, even in my engagement with BRICS member countries, countries that have fought this battle have done well by setting up corruption courts so that you can deal with the chain of evidence better. A normal investigating officer, even in an SIU or in the National Prosecuting Authority, the collection of evidence is the burden is quite heavy. And so we are incapable of being able to prove these cases. I mean, Jacob Zuma's case alone, whether he's corrupt or not, is another debate, but it's gone on for over 15 years. So if that takes that long, it means that your systems aren't working. Whereas if we have a corruption court, we have specialized investigation into that. But here's an idea I've been thinking about a long time, and I'd like for South Africans to give us feedback. What if we eradicated cash? Because unaccountable money, when people are moving cash around, is often sometimes where the real corruption sometimes takes place. You hear people moving millions and millions of rands in their cars. Whereas by financial intelligence, if we're able to create an environment upon which we depended more on a cashless society and we're able to transfer money, you could track that money and you could know who's being paid for what, so that you can use technology like blockchain and other technologies so that you can prevent corruption from occurring.
Right, Mmusi,
we need to be radical and bold.
Let's leave it there for today on that note. I appreciate your time and thank you for indulging us tonight.
It's been a privilege. Thank you very much.
That's the One SA movement leader there. Mmusi Maimane.